How do we prepare for the most important moments of our lives? Our B'nai Mitzvah students spend months, sometimes years, preparing to lead us in prayer, polishing their Hebrew, studying with their tutor and the rabbis, and reflecting on what it means to become a Jewish adult and be part of this community. To graduate any level of schooling, we'll spend years studying, taking tests or writing essays, and demonstrating our knowledge and mastery of certain subjects. For a wedding, we may spend months, or sometimes years, preparing, finding the right dress or suit or clothing that makes us feel most regal, choosing music, food, decor, poetry, and ritual that represents the new life we begin. We often know these moments are coming years in advance, and so we're given the time to prepare mentally, physically, emotionally for these times of transition and change. And even when the lead-up time is shorter than years, perhaps receiving an award, getting a new job or a promotion, competing in a sports tournament, we still have time to prepare and center ourselves so that we arrive at this important moment with clarity and focus. Similarly, when we approach moments of spiritual awakening or deep connection, we hope to engage with them as our best prepared, most focused, and open-hearted selves. For example, we do not arrive at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, unexpectedly, but rather there's an entire month preceding, called Elul, for reflection, introspection, and preparing ourselves spiritually for the High Holy Days. It's followed then by the 10 days of awe between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to provide even more focused time to work on improving ourselves. And just as we would not arrive to a B'nai Mitzvah or a wedding or an exam for school unprepared, so too we prepare our hearts and minds for religious and spiritual experiences. In our Torah portion this week, titled Yitro, the Israelites are given 3 days to prepare for the most important moment of their collective story, receiving the 10 Commandments and creating a sacred covenant with God. God said to Moses, "Go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes, let them be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day, God will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, 'Beware of going up to the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death without being touched, by either being stoned or shot, animal or person, a trespasser shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain.'" The Israelites have been freed from slavery in Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea and begun their journey to the Promised Land. And they now stand at the base of Mount Sinai to make a covenant with God. And a moment like this cannot be rushed. They can only receive divine revelation once they are spiritually primed. And God gives them 3 days to get ready. They are to refrain from sexual intercourse to remain ritually pure. They must wash their clothes to be physically clean. They are not to touch the mountain nor try to ascend to find God, but rather to wait for God to come down to them. For 3 days, they should spiritually, physically, and mentally get ready to receive revelation. And only then will they be ready to hear the voice of God. And many of our traditions today reflect a similar pattern of preparation for intense spiritual moments, albeit usually with a shorter time frame. We may wear special clothing to the synagogue, marking it a sacred time. We have music and melodies that mark Shabbat and the holidays, elevating our prayers beyond the words of the page. We may prepare a special meal to share or set aside time to see family and friends. Even the structure of the Friday night service brings us slowly into Shabbat with song and poetry that usher us from ordinary time into sacred time. And all of these rituals allow us to enter Shabbat, or a holiday, with that intentionality and focus. But I imagine many of us can think of moments of spiritual clarity or revelation that did not come in the synagogue through choreographed prayer, but rather spontaneously, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Our sages, writing in the Mishnah as far back as the 1st and 2nd centuries, were aware of this tension. They debated and tried to untangle the question of fixed prayer and spontaneous prayer. Should we pray with the words on the page or say what is in our minds? How do we prevent our prayers from feeling stale or rote if we repeat them each day or each week? What even is prayer, and how should one prepare oneself to engage in such an endeavor? Pirkei Avot, Teachings of the Fathers, says, "Be careful with the reading of the Shema and the Amidah. When you pray, do not make your prayer automatic, but rather a plea for compassion before God." And Rabbi Israel Lipschitz adds in the 19th century, "Do not make your prayer automatic means do not pray only according to the fixed words on the page, and not only because you are obligated. A plea for compassion before God means that we should pray with pleading, like a poor person who stands at the king's door with a broken mind. Therefore, each day we should innovate a prayer according to what your soul pours out to you." Our sages, who were committed to the traditional language of prayer, do not want these prayers to become boring or lose meaning to us. They ask us to use the liturgy rather as a guide, while including our own personal prayers based on our current challenges, gratitudes, feelings. And the Talmud records that the righteous sages of old would come to the house of prayer an hour before the service and sit in contemplation to prepare themselves to pray. However, the rabbis of Talmud also knew that prolonged spiritual focus is quite difficult and reported their own series of distractions while praying. Rabbi Chia said of himself that he was never able to sit with kavanah, spiritual intention, through his entire prayer. Once, when he tried to concentrate during his prayer, he began to ponder who is more important before the king, this minister or that one. Shmuel said, "I have counted newly hatched chicks while I was praying." Rabbi Bon Bar Chia said, "While I was praying, I counted the rows of the building." Rabbi Matanya said, "I am grateful for my head, for even when I am not paying attention to what I'm saying, it knows by itself to bow at the Thanksgiving prayer." So even for our sages, arguably perhaps the most well-versed in our tradition, achieving this spiritual focus is not always a given. They struggled, as I'm sure many of us do, with finding an authentic spiritual experience during prayer. The words of our prayer books are beautiful and evoke powerful imagery and feeling, and yet in some moments, our minds are simply not ready to engage spiritually. And what of these spontaneous spiritual moments? When a rainbow adorns the sky, when we hike to the top of a mountain and behold a breathtaking view, when our children laugh for the first time, or a mentor confers wisdom to us. What about the moments where our souls are simply bursting with joy and feel the wonder of being alive and want to shout out from the deep? These moments can spring forward and surprise us, and the spiritual truth, uplift, we may feel is no less valued in our tradition than our more scripted prayers. And they provide us with an opportunity to say the deepest truths of our souls, to feel connected, and to let that natural, perfect joy sweep over us. When we have the words to express this, our tradition asks us to use them. That's why we set aside time in the Amidah for personal prayer, because we know the prayers as they are written could never fully cover all of the thoughts and worries on our hearts. We have a month of preparation leading up to the high holidays so that we are not unprepared on those special days. We eulogize at a funeral because we know the traditional prayers cannot fully capture the memory of a loved one. And we share joyous stories at weddings in order to bring joy to the couple. Jewish tradition holds a place for both the formulaic and the innovative prayer. So returning to our Torah portion, the Israelites are about to experience a spiritual moment unparalleled by anything they've seen before. They will hear the voice of God. They will enter divine covenant for them and their descendants. So it is appropriate that they spend these days preparing, focusing with intention as they get ready for this pivotal scene. But at the beginning of the book of Exodus, a few weeks ago, the Torah showed us a very different encounter with God, when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush. In this story, Moses does not know when he wakes up that morning that he will hear God's voice. He does not know that he will be charged with leading the people. For Moses, it's just another day as a shepherd, when suddenly he experiences spiritual epiphany that will alter the course of his life and the future for the Israelites. He has no time to prepare, but rather has a spontaneous divine encounter. And I hold these stories side by side to illustrate that even in the Torah, spiritual elevation comes both from days of preparation and sometimes with no warning at all. Jewish tradition understands that sometimes we need the structure and the words of a fixed prayer, and in other moments, we freely encounter the divine with no warning. Israel and God have a personal connection, one that is sometimes found in the words of our Siddur, our prayer book, the melodies of our tradition and rituals passed down through generations. But at other moments, we can find God in personal connection, when we gather in community, when we walk through the forests or hear the crashing waves of creation, perhaps when we see the peace of bumblebees flitting between the spring flowers. The Torah offers many different ways to find and engage with God, and our role is to remain open to those moments of spiritual clarity, whether we find them in the words on the page or in the brilliant colors of the sunset over the ocean. Shabbat Shalom.